organized by Center for Public Policy Research. Today, we will be discussing the Ukraine crisis and strategic implications for India's foreign relations. CPPR is an independent public policy think tank based out in Kochi, an Indian state of Kerala. Our engagement in public policy that began in 2004 has initiated open dialogue, policy changes, and institutional transformation in the areas of international relations and security, livelihood, education, urban reform, health, governance, and law. To know more about what we do, please do visit our website, www.cppr.in, and our social media accounts. The CPPR Town Hall series is a live virtual discussion forum for leading minds across the world to converse and critique the state of play in public policy. I am Sharon Koshy, Associate Research at CPPR, the Center for Public Policy Research. Today, we have with us Professor Dr. T.V. Paul and Ambassador T.P. Sreenivasan. Professor Dr. T.V. Paul is a James McGill Professor of International Relations, Department of Political Science at McGill University, Canada. Professor Paul's research interests pertain to regional security, international security, nuclear proliferation, war and conflict, and South Asia. Professor Paul is a proponent of case study-driven approach to research with pertinent contributions to topics such as asymmetric conflicts, soft balancing, the tradition of nuclear non-use, and status accommodation of rising powers. He has authored and edited 21 books and nearly 85 journal articles and book chapters. He served as the 56th president of the International Studies Association from 2016 to 17. Professor Paul was also elected Fellow of Royal Society of Canada in 2018. In 2019, he initiated the Global Research Network for Peaceful Change to promote scholarship in this underexplored area of study. Ambassador T.P. Sreenivasan is a former ambassador and permanent representative of India to the United Nations. He was also governor for India of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Vienna, and ambassador to Austria and Slovenia. Ambassador Sreenivasan has served in the Indian Foreign Service for 37 years. He has nearly 20 years of experience in multilateral diplomacy and has represented India at a number of international conferences organized by the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and the Non-Aligned Movement. Welcome, Professor Paul and Ambassador Sreenivasan, to today's town hall.
Thank you.
With the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine as autonomous provinces, the refurbished Soviet principle of limited sovereignty has again become a point of discussion. The crisis unfurling in Ukraine in the past few weeks, sponsored by Russian revisionist policies, has to be read as a consistent furthering of Russia's geopolitical agenda to keep the former Soviet Republic dependent and subordinate. The Russian invasion of the eastern borders of Ukraine meticulously followed the tactics of producing ideological discourse to justify the instigation of separatist tendencies and military offense on civilians. Putin's idea of a subordinated Ukraine has lent itself from the limited sovereignty principle of Soviet era, impairing strategic, economic, and political autonomy of that country. Given Russia's clout in the region, the aggression and accompanying revisionist narrative present an opportunity for the democratic spectrum of world nations to either stay true to their ideological rhetoric or opt for the easier path of opportunism. This may be a good time for India to re-examine its stance on the issue. India is poised to have implications in its immediate neighborhood, as well as its extended region of engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Whether India should proactively work out a dual policy of sanctions and aid, or choose the path of strategic autonomy, must be discussed within the larger framework of geopolitics and geostrategy. CPPR is hosting this webinar to invite attention to strategically pertinent issues that have to be discussed against the breakdown of democracy in Eastern Europe, with particular speakers. A note to the participants here, you may type in your questions to our speakers in the chat box below. Those joining from YouTube Live can comment there. Our team will direct the questions to the speakers. You can follow our live tweets and share your thoughts using the hashtag CPPR Town Hall. Starting off today's town hall, I would like to invite Professor Paul and Ambassador Sreenivasan to share the initial thoughts on the Russian invasion and the unfolding of crisis in Ukraine. Professor Paul?
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Ambassador Sreenivasan, for joining us on this panel. My thoughts are broader. I think we are in a very important turning point in historical terms, perhaps similar to 1989 to 1991, partly because here we are after some 30 years of great power peace. We have entered an era of uncertainty and conflict. Bringing back this great power conflict and great power violence is very bad news for countries like India. I'll come to that in a minute, but it is more than that to the world order. It's been an era of globalization with lots of benefits and drawbacks. And India and China, more than India, benefited tremendously from this opening of the world economy to those countries. Suddenly, we are now looking at the prospects of perhaps two blocks emerging. May not be exactly the way it was before during the Cold War, but there are definitely efforts by China and Russia to get out of this Western dominant international order, especially the economic order. So where is the place for India there? That's one big question. The other question is, in that context, what is the grand strategy of India, the best grand strategy? What we are witnessing is there are some three strategies that countries often pursue. One is called balancing. That's against aggressive powers. You form a coalition or build up your capabilities. The other one is bandwagoning. That means join the aggressor, get the spoil out of it. The third is called buck passing. By the way, these are ideal forms. Buck passing is not doing anything about it. Wait and watch. And I think the Indian policy right now is almost similar to that third one, which has its benefits and drawbacks, because when the order is discussed or decided, the buck passer may not have much of a voice in it. India wants to have a voice in the world order. Whether India will get that voice if it buck passes or continues to stay out of the game for too long, that's one question. The other question is, all parties here misperceived hugely, the West in particular encouraging the Ukrainians to stand up and fight and not giving diplomacy a chance as much as they should have, and NATO's impotence in deterring. And Putin in a big way, because I think the more I'm reading now, he's very angry with his advisors who apparently advised him to go in an easy walkover over Ukraine. If this turned out to be another Afghanistan type invasion, then Putin is done. Russia is done for next 10 years or so. So his best chance is to inflict punishment, get out of it with some kind of a deal. But that won't necessarily mean his own status, his country's status will remain as good as it is. The other problem is we need Russia as a normal state, a pole in the international system, not an aggressive power that is upsetting the order, challenging all the normative foundations of international order built around non-interference, sovereign equality. And the way he's pushing back international organizations, all these are definitely worrisome because we don't know what kind of order will emerge. And if there is an order that will affect the smaller states again, second-ranking states as well. And finally, the over-militarization of international order. What you notice is the javelins are going like some kind of a video game, and people are getting such a glee out of it. So killing and deaths and all are normalized. And I do worry that this excessive focus on military buildup will be a bit like Cold War, where development and poor people will suffer more than the rich, poor countries. And you already noticed that in Sri Lanka. I noticed the oil price rise is affecting their food supply, etc. So deglobalization is going to hurt, but at the same time, the Western order has its own problems. But I also see Putin is trying to bring back some kind of order which is bad for everybody concerned, including India.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Sreenivasan, what are your thoughts on?
Thank you very much for asking me. Pleasure to and honor to be with Professor T.V. Paul. I generally agree with what he has just said, as different from what Sharon said earlier, that she saw in it a kind of old Soviet preoccupations. It is true that Russians were settled in all these republics with the same objective that she mentioned, to keep everybody under control. And that was the purpose of it. And that's what the Chinese have done in Tibet also. That's an old technique. And that is how we have these pockets of Russians in every republic. So that is there. But that is not really the issue now, I think. I think the war is between NATO and Russia. Ukraine, this war is not against Ukraine. I think it's sometimes lost sight of. Because Ukraine cannot deliver what Putin wants, even if they surrender. Even if Zelensky surrenders tomorrow and put Ukraine under his control, Putin would not have won what he wanted. He started off with a demand for security for his country. And that security for his country cannot be given by Ukraine or anybody else. It can be given only by the United States and NATO. But strangely enough, and I was trying to compare this war with many other wars one knows about. I'm not a historian, but historians will be able to see all these differences. So I identified at least 3 or 4 unique features of this war. One is this, that is not a direct war. We have used the word proxy war, but it's not a proxy war in that sense. It's a real war between Russia and Ukraine. But the objective is not to dominate Ukraine, not to defeat Ukraine, not to destroy it. And that is part of the reason why Russia has not been able to make much headway. They are trying to be careful because they have to rebuild all these buildings that they're going to destroy. So whether he can gain what he wants, he started off with security, then he went up to the point of talking about reinstatement of Soviet Union and so on, that is his fancy ideas. So there is a whole range of things that he has spelled out. And none of these he can get from Ukraine. So that is not the issue. He can probably capture it tomorrow, but then what is the use of that? Because then what will happen is the support of NATO to Ukraine will increase and therefore threaten Putin's own security. So what is he trying to do? He probably thought that he would be able to drag in NATO in terms of some kind of a guarantee that Ukraine and others will not join NATO. And they were not in the danger of joining NATO. There was no formality. It would have taken several years before they became NATO countries. So he said, I will attack only if they join NATO. So who is it that violated that idea that there should be space for negotiations? It was Putin himself. In fact, our foreign minister, Jaishankar, was in Paris talking to the French president at the time when the war broke out or invasion started. So his plan, and he says he is going according to plan, is entirely different from what it has turned out to be. He expected that this attack on Ukraine will immediately bring NATO and United States to the negotiating table. Instead, they said, we will not fight a war, but we will fight with sanctions. Probably in history, this is the first time a country or countries are saying, we are fighting with sanctions, not with weapons. It sounds good because, it doesn't destroy people, doesn't destroy buildings. But the kind of sanctions that they have imposed are also unprecedented. Have you ever heard of sanctions of this kind, which is actually strangulating not only Russia, but also NATO itself? So, and that is something very new, that somebody is resisting an armed invasion with sanctions. And I thought at that time that these sanctions will take many years. Look at Iranians, it took them 10 or 12 years to surrender. So Putin will not surrender at all. But now it looks that he is reacting quite strongly to these sanctions. And today I heard that he has made a declaration that he will use the intellectual property of the so-called unfriendly countries and take charge of the technology and give it to the world free of charge. So look at that approach. So this is a new kind of war. That's what I mean. So in very many respects, it's a new kind of war. As far as India's position is concerned, I've always argued that our position was right, because abstention does not mean any kind of acquiescence in the Soviet action. In fact, in the explanation of vote, we took away with the left hand what we gave with the right hand, because we repeatedly said these are the reasons why we are. So we are playing it well. Americans are unhappy, but they are not also as unhappy as they appear to be. Even on S-400, I do not expect Americans to take any action, because in the ultimate analysis, they know they have to confront China, and India is important. So we may have made everybody equally unhappy, and that's not a bad result of a diplomatic move. And we have kept our options open. It is Professor Paul who keeps on saying that this is balancing, temporary balancing. People are waiting for the near reality to come, then they want to jump here and there. And that's been his thesis, as I understand it. Because everybody is kind of floating in the air without deciding what they want to do. So keeping with that spirit, I think India has done fairly well. And now we have been offered oil by the Russians. What a great blessing that we will have when the prices are going up. Of course, this will again create a crisis in the West, because they thought that they had shut off oil supplies, and here comes India to buying it. And we cannot resist it, because that will be an interesting proposal for us. So we know that things will be bad, but the bad thing is, the last point, the bad thing has happened to us is the Russia-China coalition, because that is a serious matter. If you read the agreement between Putin and Xi Jinping in Beijing, it is more than a coalition, more than an alliance, because it says no activities prohibited. And this is stronger than the alliance like Warsaw Pact or NATO. So these are very significant meaning, which means that puts us in trouble, because we were hoping that there will be a US-China Cold War, and India with his, kind of new non-alignment, we might have as a partner Russia. That was in our minds, that if there is going to be a third pole, could be Russia, France, Germany, etc., could be with us. But that has now completely changed. And you have a situation where China and Russia might act together, which will drive us into the arms of the Americans. And the Americans will not be very happy, because we have our supply chain from Russia. They will very seriously object to our continuing with it, which means that we have to find alternate supplies immediately, because without Russians, we cannot run our defense forces at all. So India has also very serious problems. But the problem is, how is this war going to end? What is Putin's objective? If tomorrow Zelensky surrenders and he can put a puppet government in Kiev, is it going to solve any problem? In fact, it will only increase his problem. So he seems to have been caught in a bind unexpectedly. And this is probably first time in history that a country gets bogged down in a neighboring country, because the Americans got bogged down in Vietnam. That's a different story. Here, it is like, Pakistan attacking India, or India attacking Pakistan, getting stuck. And for how long, we don't know. So it's a first-rate problem for Russia in the first hand. It has helped the Americans a little, because the image of President Biden is improving slightly internally. China is the winner, because they are basically witnessing it. They can turn anyway. In a way, China also is taking a similar position like in India. So this is the total confusion, and we do not know what is going to emerge from this. And probably we can compare it with the pandemic. We thought pandemic will end in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Then what did we decide? We decided we live the pandemic. We live with the pandemic. So maybe we have to live with Putin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. On that note, can we talk about India's abstention from the UNSC vote condemning Russian aggression? Because what has been probably the rationale behind India's abstention and the stance on the issue in the past few weeks, and how have this affected our relationships with our partners, the way we reacted without unity on the issue? And how do you think this would impact our public image as the largest democracy in the world?
You want one of us answer,
Either.
or
I mean, both. Either.
yeah.
You go,
So I'll just give a sense of. I'm watching the Western media, so I can tell you it hasn't gone down very well here. They are definitely, again, they misperceived how much India will support America at this point. So, but India is not alone. There are some interesting articles talking about Turkey, Indonesia to Brazil, several countries kind of, and of course the Persian Gulf countries taking a kind of approach to like India. I think it has not done well because there's actually a question in the chat room about non-alignment. Non-alignment actually was very much against colonialism, imperialism, and all these things that Putin is doing, or getting rid of the state sovereignty rights. So from a normative point of view, this is not good for India's long-standing position on what do you call these great power interventions that it opposed in the past. That apart, I think tactically it makes sense. Right now, you don't want to lose both sides, but you need a longer term strategy. That's where I worry about whether this ad hocism or temporary approaches will bring much good. I mean, it may bring some oil at some point or something, but so if people in Delhi are thinking about it, they definitely need to support the Ukrainian people, the suffering of those people. You cannot just stand away and say, we don't really care, although they have made statements, not sufficient. What they could definitely do is to come up with the substantial support for the refugees or peacekeeping ideas. Turkey is doing, by the way, some level of diplomacy has to come out to cushion whatever negative impact this is causing. This is what I'm saying. Buck passing or getting it away, keeping away is not enough in the long run. If you want to play a leading role in the global order of 21st century, if you want to be just a marginal player, yes, but that's not what India wants. You want to be a bridging power, a swing power. All this would require playing a role in world order conception. And so UN is a forum where now India has more opportunities will come, but clearly some creative thinking is needed to get out of this mess, which is not India's fault. But the point is, it has enormous implications for India and the world.
Well, I have already indicated my thinking about this, saying that India has done well by doing what it did. But let me elaborate a little more. We took the same position in 1979, because the vote was in 1980, during the Afghanistan crisis. I was a witness to the change that took place in Delhi. I physically saw how Charan Singh approached it and Mrs. Gandhi approached it on the same day, because both were prime ministers. One was prime minister's designate and the other was prime minister. So Charan Singh said to us, I'm going to call up Vorontsov and tell him to get out of Soviet Union. That was but when Vorontsov walked in, he first said, I'm just coming from Mrs. Gandhi's residence. And she was very sympathetic and supportive. And Charan Singh did not know where to look. And so he said, okay, then our meeting is over. So, and that was a dramatic moment, because at that time in Delhi, there were many suggestions that this is the time that we should now approach Pakistan and meet the Soviet threats together. There was an extreme point of view there. And Mrs. Gandhi took a very firm position that it was not going to be so. And 5 years, not only 5 years, last 20 years, we have resisted the Taliban and others with the Soviet Union, without the Soviet Union, with the Americans and so on. So there is a history to this. Then we cannot also forget the various vetoes that the Soviet Union exercised in the Security Council at the time of Kashmir, at the time of Goa, at the time of Bangladesh, at the time of Afghanistan. If those vetoes were not used at that time, India would have been embarrassed in very serious manner with the international community. So these backgrounds you have to bear in mind. The Americans were very unhappy in 1980. They even cut off Tarapur fuel for us. Nothing, not related to Afghanistan. But that was expected. And therefore, we could not have done differently now because we are in the Quad, but we still stay outside the other 3 Quad countries voted for the resolution. But as I said earlier, we clarified that position. That's why I said UN votes are not black and white. The procedures in the United Nations allow countries to nuance their positions. And that's what we have done. There are several instances of that. And therefore, we could not have done differently. But as I said earlier, this is not a rigid or firm position. It is a flexible position. And we could, as time passes, we could play around with it. But if we had taken a position of strong support or strong denial, it would have been more difficult for India to shape its own point. And the last point about the difference between non-alignment and strategic autonomy is that there is no ideological commitment in strategic autonomy. We are now not talking about non-alignment, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-apartheid, pro-Palestine. Those elements are not there in strategic autonomy. So that I don't think we need to worry about that. But we need to worry about how we manage our relationship with the United States in the context of China. And that is going to be the biggest challenge. And there we may have to be more Altmannarpur. That seems to be the only way. You cannot depend on anybody else.
Thank you, sir. Moving on, let's talk about the strategic or security implications of the crisis for India. Professor Paul, what do you think the Ukraine crisis mean for India in our immediate neighborhood, and how would the potential warming of ties between China and Russia reflect on our security concerns?
Okay, that's what the ambassador was talking about in terms of strategic autonomy. The question is how much autonomy this crisis will bring, or will this bring more restraints and constraints on strategic autonomy? I think India is in a difficult situation because strategic autonomy is not that feasible if you're dependent on 1 or 2 parties for your main arms supply, your oil, your economic well-being, etc. So that's what I meant when deglobalization comes in. If you don't have these things at home, then you are dependent. So this dependency status increases insecurity in many ways, of course, in a larger context. But beyond that, I think the biggest challenge is navigating this China-Russia relationship, how that is going to shape. If that's going to be a polarized international system, then India may have tough time playing this game that they have been playing for a while, because then the West will expect to join them in terms of forming some kind of coalition. And so there is going to be a serious challenge. More than that, what sort of weapons now India can import, or will it have to go to other suppliers like European or American, which, by the way, they put a lot of conditions on India, and India is not happy often. So it is a tough time to navigate this crisis. But one element that is in the chat also is about the nuclear issue, which is nuclear weapons are now suddenly becoming more important in this domain, partly because Ukraine, as Lawrence Prabhakar says, gave up nuclear weapons, and then now look what happens. There are a lot of questions whether Ukraine would have had the capacity to maintain an operational nuclear capability in 1994 when it gave it up. In any case, it just shows that the commitment Russia and many other Western countries gave with respect to Ukraine's security are completely violated. This means it's not clear whether these commitments given by Russia to other states or anybody are sacrosanct. So India has to be very careful with respect to what sort of nuclear order is emerging. And there is a lot of worry that cornered Putin might use a tactical weapon or something to show his prowess. That will be very disastrous for India in terms of India and other countries, in terms of this whole idea of nuclear taboo, how that will be broken. And it is bad because that affects the the contagious effect, how that will affect Pakistan's calculations or China's calculations. And so nuclear use is not good, especially for neighboring countries of this situation. But I think it is a period of intense uncertainty, and uncertainty creates all kinds of behavioral tendencies among powers, and we are already witnessing that. So the 20, 30 years of fairly long peace is now shattered. So that's what I mean. A strategic reorientation is needed, but it takes some time to even to see where this conflict is going. I don't think it will be an immediate short-term benefits are not what we should worry too much. It's also managing the long-term consequences of this conflict.
To discuss a bit more about the implications, security implications in India's extended neighborhood, particularly Indo-Pacific, we see that there's a rising bonhomie between Russia and China, and this is a cause of concern for many of our partners in the Indo-Pacific region, including those in Quad and ASEAN countries. So with Act East policy and security in Indo-Pacific taking precedence in our foreign policy narrative, what potential security challenges could India face beyond Asia or beyond its immediate neighborhood?
If I may touch upon the nuclear issue for a moment.
Yes, yes, please.
The fact that Ukraine and Belarus gave up nuclear weapons, it's a myth, because they were never nuclear weapon states. Soviet Union was a nuclear weapon state. And the moment they became independent, it was mandatory for them to surrender their weapons either to Soviet Union or to the IAEA. And I was dealing with the IAEA those days when it was made very clear that not even a piece of metal will be allowed to stay in either of these two countries. And they had to sign the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. So all this hue and cry about Ukraine, if they had kept the nuclear weapons, they could have used it. And some people even suspect that they have it somewhere hidden away. These are just mythology, I think, because that's not possible. And I also do not think, I hope, Mr. Putin will ever use any kind of nuclear weapon, because how does that help him in his, presuming that he is not a psychopath or he does not have a problem of personality, which Westerners are suspecting. That's a different matter. But a logical thinker and a fighter that he's supposed to be, he cannot use nuclear weapons of any kind, because that will be the end of not only of the world as a whole, but also it will be a very serious problem for him, because the Americans will immediately be able to wipe out Russia. And the experience of 1962 is very much there. There was no compromise between Khrushchev and Kennedy. They were both afraid to touch that button. That's all that happened in 1962. So one pulled a hand back, the other also pulled back simultaneously. So that is not a possibility. But in terms of international law, international behavior, even using the threat of nuclear weapons is a crime towards humanity, because it is blackmail. It causes the balance in the world. And therefore, he has already committed a crime as far as international law is concerned. But I do not expect that he will use it, because no need to say that it will be ruinous. As far as we are concerned, on the security angle, what Professor Paul has said is very important, because we are 70%, according to CPPR, even 82% dependent on our weapons with the Russians. And this cannot be changed overnight. And we signed 26 agreements with Putin when he came to Delhi. I'm sure he did not tell our Prime Minister that he was going to invade Ukraine. But we presumed that things were going to be normal. It's on that basis that we went on to sign all these agreements. Because the difference between Western defense supplies and the Russian defense supplies is that we get permission to manufacture, we get technology. And that is the one reason why we always gone for, apart from it being cheap and they were willing to buy our consumer goods, etc. But that persuaded us to buy more and more from Russia. It was a godsend opportunity for us to build our industry, build our defense, etc., on the basis of this virtually free arrangement, the rupee ruble arrangement that we had. That was a big blessing. And so that's why we went this far, in spite of the fact that technology was not so good. Even now we talk about MiG planes are flying coffins and things like that. So the inefficiency or insufficiency of the technology of the Russians is known to us, but still we have done it consciously because the alternative would not have been so favorable. So this is likely to be affected by the change, not immediately, but certainly we will be pushed by the Americans to engage in sanctions against Russia, at least not, take supplies, defense supplies from them as a part of the Quad arrangement, and that will intensify. And then we have this whole issue of China. We need to have powerful friends, and therefore we will have to go closer to the US, and therefore we will have more supplies from the US, even though that will cost money. And so our security scenario is going to be altered very much. And as Professor Paul said, we do not know in what form it will be, and whether we'll be able to steer through this crisis without any serious danger to our own security is a matter to be seen. But I think Delhi is very conscious of all these dangers, and we are engaging with everybody. But I wrote the other day that it's not selective alignment, but universal alignment. We don't mind aligning ourselves with anybody, provided we have benefits from it. And that's a good approach in a very flexible, a world which is in a flux, because we don't want to exclude anyone, we don't want to embrace anyone too firmly, and I suppose that is all that India can do at the moment. We have people with sympathy elsewhere in the world, ASEAN, for example. Our links with ASEAN are very strong, and it goes back to the old days of maritime, record in Southeast Asia, which is now being highlighted. And that is why we have a good relationship with ASEAN. It was not a military agreement, but at the same time, we have been able to have a security dialogue. So, but no other region do we have that kind of, we don't have a SARC to talk about. Our linkages with the Russians have become tenuous. And therefore, we have to somehow balance United States with some other smaller countries which share the anxiety about a complete US dominance of the Indo-Pacific. And that's going to be a challenge.
Finally, before we open the floor for question and answers, I would like to turn our attention to talks about peace negotiations. Ukraine's lead negotiator has in fact made it clear that they prefer a multilateral agreement to a bilateral one between just Russia and Ukraine. So although the number of participating countries are still being discussed, I would like to ask both our speakers, what do you think are the chances that India will be given a seat at the negotiating table? And what roles do you envision India playing in the proceedings?
Ambassador is better able to answer that. From my reading, this is what I started off by saying: if you want to play a leading role, you have to be proactive. So that's a challenge here. Will India be invited? To be invited, what is India's contribution? So maybe peacekeeping is area where India has been contributing in a big way. But the larger question is why these negotiations are unlikely to produce an optimal outcome, at least in the short run, because neither party has lost. Neither party has exhausted enough the hurting stalemate they talk about in negotiations to reach an agreement. And so Russia, they may sign something unless it is based on some durable ideas and principles, and it's going to be very hard to maintain it. So what happened in Chechnya, you have 2-3 episodes of war. Afghanistan also had, Vietnam had periods of peace, Paris Agreement and all that, but they don't last if they are not based on some fundamental ground realities. So I think Russia is in a war that may last several years, even if it's over with respect to the main Ukrainian body, that those two provinces that Russia wants to keep as so-called independent states. How far Ukraine can afford to let that go? How far NATO will allow that to go? By the way, this is a godsend opportunity, at least from some American calculators, to bring the American hegemony back, because it allows it to unify the European powers under American umbrella, because NATO is toothless without America. And it unifies the domestic American population too, because this is one area where Americans agree that is this common enemy. So there's Russophobia, that's Russia is this enemy, Russians are the enemies. They're very much coming back as far as I see it. So I think India should have a place in these board meetings, but who is going to bring India unless some form of like BRICS? I think this is where if Ambassador, I don't know what you think about, BRICS should play a bigger role here. India is a member of that. It's a smaller coalition, and there's Brazil, there's South Africa, and they're having a meeting, I believe, in China in next year or something. But right now, BRICS may be a forum to discuss this and see whether Putin can be tamed. And otherwise, what is the purpose of BRICS if it doesn't solve these big crises in situations like this?
Well, Professor Paul, BRICS was never meant to be a peacemaker or a strategic body. It was invented, as you know, in the United States by an economics professor who thought that these countries had similar features economically, and therefore they could work together. And then it became an body. So it was never. But there was another very interesting proposal that Russia made to Prime Minister Modi when he was in Delhi, was the idea of a three-country meeting, that is Russia, China, and India, RIC. And then somebody said that why don't we put in United States also into it? That'll be wonderful. You know, another quad. That would be a dream team. But we all know that it is not likely to happen. Mr. Putin must have withdrawn his proposal for an RIC, and the US is not very anxious to get in there. But let us be realistic about our expectations. So if the argument is that we must get into a negotiation, then our abstention is perfect. Then we should not object to the abstention, because that is one saving grace that we have not opposed to it. But that is not how people look at it. What we can bring to the table is the main question. As far as India is concerned, if you look at the Indian media, the war in Ukraine is over 2 days ago, when the last Indian student came out of Ukraine. Now there is no war. We are having our own fight about K-rail and this rail and that rail. There is no discussion on Ukraine taking place in the media in India to the extent it was during the evacuation stage. So we became a party to the whole thing because of our evacuation. And Prime Minister Modi got a very good chance to speak to Mr. Putin. If he had just called them to say that, please stop the war, he would not have picked up the call. We said that the issue is this: we want our Indians back, and that he could not refuse. So he got both those two phone calls because of their interest to see that India's interests are not hurt. Not to invite India to the conversation. I don't think so. And now that is over, then where is the beginning of a conversation? So that is not likely to happen. And direct negotiations between Putin and Ukraine will not help. Because as I said right from the beginning, these are not they are not the adversaries. The adversary is sitting somewhere else. So the only way is for the big two to talk. And there I don't think they will have any place, but we may have some influence in bringing them together. And there we have the years of the Americans. We have hopefully some years with the Russians. And then there are people like Turkey and others who are trying to do any good. But mediation or arbitration will not be welcomed by either side. And as we know, we ourselves have a very strong position against any mediation. Because after Tashkent, we know mediation is a dangerous thing, because A mediator wants only peace. They are not interested in the interests of the two countries. So they will force you to make concessions. And that is why we have said no mediation. So this might be the position that others might also take. I think that the delegations, the meeting will have to be between Biden and Putin, as I can see it. And the sooner that takes place, the better.
With this, we've come to the concluding part of our session. Thank you for sharing your insightful thoughts, Professor Paul and Ambassador Sreenivasan. We shall now open the floor for Q&A. Let's start off with the question addressed to both the speakers. Is India's stance in the issue indicative, perhaps, of its shedding of value-oriented foreign policy to an opportunistic foreign policy?
First of all,
that's for sure. But all countries are opportunistic, even when they preach value, as we know, in international politics. But how you project values, some values are good for you, okay? It's not clear whether there's a value that I was talking about, the great power violence, preventing that violence. Great powers are the biggest killers of human history. People forget that. I mean, before that, of course, imperial powers. 20th century's largest source of death was great power war, other than natural causes. And these guys are, and there's actually a question about how they play UN Security Council. So why do we need principles? Because we need to restrain them somehow. They have all the guns, they have all the attitudes, and look at how mercilessly they're pounding on these innocent Ukrainians in many ways. So that is your interest, and you cannot just say that's not your interest. Somehow we can wash. Ambassador is quite poignant that the Indian media is moving away. I mean, it seems like, this is another war happening in another part of the world. No, it's happening in your backyard. It's just 3 hours from you. Okay, it's not even far. It's Koshy to Delhi's time. So it's mindless to think about. The Afghanistan showed that these kind of wars can have such negative impact. And so principles are important. Without principles or projection of those principles, even your strategic interest cannot be presented properly. See, why Biden is using all these things? Because it gives him legitimacy. And for a rising power like India, you need legitimacy in the system. And legitimacy comes with some amount of principles and ideologies, ideas that others will accept as valuable. Now, that doesn't mean giving up your core interest. That's very, very clear. I think in order to be accepted by others, some amount of acceptable ideas are necessary. And that is why I've been talking about the need for grand strategic thinking. You look at all the powers in the world. I mean, Mr. Putin is abandoning it, but Russia stood for some ideas in the past. And that's why we also respect Russia for what it did on many areas, supporting decolonization to nuclear disarmament and whatnot. But today that Russia is in a very bad shape because it abandoned the same principles it was supporting. So I don't see that question is that important, but at the same time, connecting your interest with these principles are very important.
Maybe you can take another question. I don't think we need to answer the same question.
Yes, sure. This question is from Mary Abraham. The Ukraine crisis has clearly demonstrated the limitations of NATO and the UN in supporting powerful and determined aggressors like Russia. How far is its realization likely to embolden great powers attacking weaker neighbors? It's not addressed to anybody in particular.
Well, the role of the UN has already changed dramatically since the charter was framed. It was to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. There have been 800 wars since then. So that is not the role of the UN. They may have succeeded, which we have not heard about, but we only hear about failures. So from peacemaking, the role has changed to peacekeeping. If there is a war, UN waits the war to end, and then they deploy unarmed or or slightly armed soldiers and put them in the middle of the fighters, and then try and build peace. So it has become the role of the United Nations because of the veto provision. So as long as the veto provision is there, except in the case of the Gulf War #1, there was never unanimity on action by the Security Council. And therefore, as long as that is not there, there might be, of course, the Secretary General can take his own initiative for, lending his good offices and acting as the conscience of mankind, etc. But they do not mean anything in real politics. So that is why the UN does not have a role these days to either stop a war or to engage in a conversation with the parties concerned using its clout in order to bring peace. So they are waiting for peacekeeping, and peacekeeping has been a success story because even after the war is ended, there is a role for the international organizations, humanitarian intervention, etc. So that is what UN is today. It's a reality that we have to face.
If I may add, the UN Security Council is the one given the task of maintenance of peace and international security by the Charter. The great powers have definitely failed. Only on a couple of occasions they had even a collective security provision brought out against aggressors. But what I'm noticing is the General Assembly is becoming a lot more active as the parliament of the world. And that is actually good in the sense that these great powers are showing their incapacity. But the UN is needed for all parties concerned. Where else you will go if the UN is gone for even presenting your opinions? So it's a forum where, sometimes other functions are given, and it is a legitimacy giving role if it is intervention, for instance. But United Nations, other forums are doing much better. I mean, despite all criticism, even WHO has some contributions that is made. So we cannot completely say the UN is a failure, but this aspect of the UN has not been successful. That's very clear. Partly because the great powers who control don't really want their powers to go away. They have the veto power, which means they have structured it in such a way that their overlordship will not go away in any kind of way. And I think that's what is giving incentive to Putin-like figures to engage in aggression. And I think that is not going to go away until you have some other setup created, and that doesn't look good.
No, the point about the General Assembly, if I may add a word, is that is a standard solution which has no meaning. Whenever a particular resolution is vetoed by a permanent member in the Security Council, there is a resolution of the General Assembly, it's calling Uniting for Peace. So that the idea is that where Security Council fails, General Assembly steps in. But General Assembly has no teeth. They can step in, pass any resolution. Resolutions have been passed by the General Assembly in emergency sessions before, but nobody is bothered about it. It's just it is just a, what shall we say, psychological or pressure of that kind. But that has not worked. General Assembly is not designed to deal with war and peace situations. So that's just a symbolic thing. And that doesn't, make the UN any efficient in the main concern about prevention of war. That only Security Council can only do it if the 5 permanent members are unanimous about it. And you mentioned, TV, the functioning of the other organizations. The answer is clear. There is no veto. G20 has no veto. G7 has no veto. So they have to come to a compromise. So that's why they are more efficient. But they are not dealing with war. They are dealing basically with economic development and fair distribution and environment and various other things. But when it comes to war, it is to be very difficult to reach a compromise, even when there is no veto. People like to exercise veto in such contexts. So that is why people are now looking at other organizations as a way out. That will be very sad though, because the only universal body in the world is the United Nations. So G20 or G7 cannot replace it.
Because we're running out of time, we'll take one more question. This is addressed to Professor Paul from Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar. If Ukraine had not given up its share of nuclear weapons in 1991, do you think that Putin would have attacked Ukraine since given power of deterrence?
Well, we answered that a little bit before, but the point is that's a hypothetical question if whether Ukraine had this capability. Obviously, a deployed nuclear capability, even if it was a small capability, would have deterred. But then Ukraine could have not been necessarily secure from the kind of activities Putin could do. Nuclear arm does not mean Putin could not have intervened in those Russian dominated population dominated areas. And instability paradox is clearly that it allows other countries to play around deterrence. So it's not clear this outright attack probably would have been deterred, but Ukraine was a mess, by the way. You think Ukraine has got all the paraphernalia of statehood. Ukraine had considerable weaknesses as a state, agreement among themselves. So it's not clear how strong a power Ukraine would have become without the support of United States and other powers. And so Ukraine was hoping to join NATO precisely for that. If NATO brings their forces into Ukraine and provides some security, Article 5 would have kicked in, which meant an attack on any member of NATO is an attack on all. And that's what all these countries want. And that's what Russia wants to prevent. That is security deprivation for Russia, because the moment they are there, deterrence could kick in because NATO has nuclear weapons under many US command. So it is a hypothetical question. And I think you cannot go back to history and say, okay, all the countries that gave up, including South Africa, for instance, or Kazakhstan, had also a big number of nuclear weapons. These are, as Ambassador said, inherited weapons, and they were states that were formed in crises and very difficult circumstances, very weak states under the pressure of Western powers. So Ukraine would not have been able to keep it up for so long unless it becomes a North Korea type operation, which is not what Ukraine wanted. Ukraine wanted to become a European state, part of European Union, a normal state, a state that is respected by others. So your goals are not clear whether nuclear weapons would have been deterrent. Even if it provided deterrence, the other goals Ukraine wanted would not have been met by that. So that hypothetical question is problematic at this stage.
But TV, it is more than hypothetical, because the command and control of the nuclear weapons in all these republics were in Moscow. So there was no option for them to have used it at that time.
But they had a good number of scientists, nuclear scientists.
True, but they cannot launch it. They cannot launch it. The button is not with them.
I could have improvised, I guess, but even then it would have been difficult.
No, I think it was not possible. They would not have thought about it, but that was not possible.
So do we have time for 2 more questions? Because we got a lot more. So if we have time, we can take 1 or 2 more.
Okay, 2 more and then we finish.
Yes. This is addressed to Ambassador Sreenivasan. Should we be over-concerned with technology transfer in defense procurement or related issues, considering the fact that from 1990s, India had faced such restrictions or hurdles from the US and the West in areas of space technology, nuclear supplies, etc.? This is from Mr. K.V. Thomas.
No, technology is very, very important. The first thing, when we are talking about defense supplies, if we don't have the technology, they can pull the wire any moment. And these fundamental agreements that we have signed with United States, which Dr. Manmohan Singh, even in the heyday of India-US relations, did not sign, which we have now signed, impose a lot of restrictions on us. So even without buying equipment from them, now we are, in a way, kind of influenced by American decisions in making full use of our facilities. And therefore, what Russia did was an immense favor in the sense that even if their technological quality was not the best, the availability for us to use it to produce without any end user certification. So the Americans keep asking for end user certification. And that is very important in your freedom to make use of this. And that is why Russian technology was preferable to us as against Western, apart from the price.
We'll take one more question, the last question. It's from Dr. Dhanuraj. Aren't we taking a calculated risk in supporting Putin now? He's in a weaker position and the economy is suffering from the sanction. Even if he is not removed, he could be in a weak wicket.
Yes, Dr. Paul.
I don't think India is supporting Putin in a.
That's exactly the sentence I was going to say.
It's more like we are waiting and you're waiting and see whether Putin will survive. Putin's survival is in question in many ways. Even if he survives, if the war drags on, you look in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, there were quite a few changes in Soviet Union. It was that 10-year-long intervention that produced Gorbachev, as far as I remember. And so the Soviets themselves decided time to change their policy. So Putin is, it's in Putin's interest to get out of this place as soon as he can, but I don't think he will because he has so much invested and ego is a big issue for him, it seems. And the more you read about him, he's very much now confined to himself and a very small group of people. And he doesn't pay attention to advisors. He listened to some KGB guys who said intervention will be cheap. He doesn't have a good exit plan and he's in trouble. So in that sense, you cannot put all your basket in Putin's area right now. So all your positions have to be modified. I don't know how much impact, influence India has in Moscow in terms of engaging other partners too, but it's going to take some time to get rid of Putin. Putin is a disaster, I'm telling you, because it's clear that he miscalculated. He had calculated use of force in previous conflicts, which, by the way, the West supported his, or didn't say anything when he was killing people in Chechnya. And Syria, he managed to survive. So this is different. I think this is going to drag him down unless he can somehow manage to exit with some kind of a face-saving negotiation. And I don't know whether India should be, actually the question is very good, should be very careful not to wait for not to put everything with Putin, but at the same time, wait for the emergence of an alternate order in Moscow.
As for the other questions, we'll share with the speakers, but for now, we are coming to the end of the session. Professor Paul, Ambassador Sreenivasan, we thank you for engaging our minds for the past hour or so, taking us through the nuances of strategic and security challenges posed by the Ukraine crisis in India's neighborhood and beyond, and talking at length about how we can effectively navigate the current foreign policy challenges. It was an honor to host you this evening. Thank you to all the participants for logging in and listening so intently and for asking questions. At CPPR, we look forward to more of such fruitful engagements with you all through our webinars and conferences. Please follow our website and social media pages for further updates. With this, I'd like to formally close today's proceedings. Wishing you all a lovely evening and a great weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was interesting.
Recording stopped.
Okay.